right, I'll get started. So, thanks for joining us. I'm Rob Flint from the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Department of Emergency Medicine. I spend most of my time actually at the VA across the street from where we are, but I spend a good bit of time talking about faculty development, business and medicine things, as well as other topics. So, I'm really happy people could join us. Today's topic is difficult conversations, negotiating your way through life. And it's really meant kind of as a opportunity for us to talk about different ways we can approach difficult conversations and maybe get over the barriers or hurdles that we have when we do that. And certainly, I appreciate SEM for allowing me to participate in this series. And let's take a look. So, first of all, I don't have any financial conflicts of interest with this or any other conflicts. I'm hoping by the end of this, the learners and the people that are participating will learn how to just anticipate a difficult conversation. We're going to talk about some strategies to approach difficult conversations. And we're going to practice a few techniques that I have learned over the years to get through these difficult conversations and try to get to the desired outcome that we have. So I'm going to start out by saying who enjoys conflict? And the majority of us don't. The actual reason I'm doing this talk is over the years, I have found that I don't do difficult conversations well, and I've had to read and learn and how to do it. So in order to make that better, I thought I'd put together a conversation so others hopefully can learn from my mistakes. I've made a lot of mistakes over the years in difficult conversations as a medical director in terms of performance evaluation, et cetera. And hopefully we can get over that. Very few of us do enjoy conflict. Very few of us look forward to difficult conversations. So that shouldn't be a barrier for us to actually getting what we need out of these conversations. So the first thing is none of us are born good negotiators. It's a fact that it is something you can learn and it's a skill that you can acquire. There is no reason that you cannot become a good negotiator or a person who does well with these difficult conversations. It's just a matter of practice and knowing who you are and how you should approach these. Mastering the skill, or at least even getting better at it, is very much something you can do with practice. Oh, I'm being told my slides aren't advancing. For me, they are. Hopefully they'll catch up here in a second. Using a zero come out for these conversations often leads to failure. So I would say that we're going to talk about what zero sum means and really look at how to approach conversations different than zero outcome measures. And then I would say prepare. What does that mean? You talk about substance, you talk about your mental preparation for these conversations, your body language. So as we said, not good. You're not born a good negotiator. You can make it. Zero sum outcomes often lead to failure. And we're going to talk about that a little more extensively. The preparation. And then we have to have the conversation. And I think that's a hurdle for a lot of us is we don't look forward to these conversations. We kind of dread them. So we push it off. We put it farther down our schedule or something else will come up. And we'll talk about barriers to that and how to just have these conversations. And ultimately, it's a benefit to you and it's a benefit to the person you're having this difficult conversation with. Try to being a listener during these conversations is also critical, depending a little bit on the role that you're playing. But being a good listener is really important in any conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about post-conversation evaluation. How did you have the conversation? Was it effective? How do you measure that? And how do you know that your message got through and that you were clear with it? And then follow up where appropriate. So what is a difficult conversation? You know, for lots of us, we think about difficult conversation as being antagonistic, argumentative, fraught with emotion and difficulty. And kind of these different cartoons illustrate what most of us kind of pop into our head when I say difficult conversation or conflict. These are the general things that people think about. And I have a couple of definitions here. And really what they are, these conversations are where you're trying to convey or someone is trying to convey to you their needs, their wants, their opinions, their perceptions, usually does have some feeling and emotion associated with it. And we'll talk about ways to try to control that a little bit. If you can take a little of that out, you're going to have a much more successful conversation. You're going to get your point across a little bit easier. They can have strong emotions. It can have anger, fear, or frustration. All these things are kind of baked in there. But really, this is a conversation where the other person may find what you're saying hard to hear. What you're saying may not want to be heard, or it may be uncomfortable. That doesn't mean you shouldn't say it, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't have the conversation. You have to be aware that it may be uncomfortable either for you to say it or for the person to hear it. But the important thing about these is to be authentic and to have a purpose and to be able to express that purpose. If you're able to convey whatever the important information is in the conversation, that's the important part. Whether it's difficult for that person to hear or difficult for you to say, if it's important, it must be done. And I think that's what we should take away from this conversation. So there's a whole litany of possible different conversations, and some that I've listed here. If you give peer feedback for whatever reason, if you're giving someone who reports to you feedback, whether that's junior faculty member, resident, student, or whoever it is along those lines, when you have to sit down and talk to the chair about a raise, or if you have to sit down to fire someone as you expand in leadership roles, these are things that often have to be done. And it can be an incredibly difficult conversation. And we'll talk about some instances where we can improve on that for your sake and for the person who's receiving that news. Obviously, interviewing can be a difficult conversation as well. Asking for promotion, probably more difficult is, why did I not get promoted? Talking to a student about poor performance, failing a student, resident attitude, and even in life, talking to your significant other about your wants and needs, whether that's negotiating a vacation, negotiating a big expenditure. Throughout our day, every day, we're negotiating for little things and big things. And if we look at it more as negotiating than a zero sum, have to have conversation, we're much likely to get closer to what we want. We're probably never going to get 100% of what we want. But if we look at this more as an open-ended negotiation where we're trying to get to a win-win situation, we're much more likely to have success and much more likely to have the conversation and really feel at the end of the conversation that you've had a positive response. Whether you completely get what you want or not, you should still feel like you've put the right effort forward for this. So when I talk about preparing, I think this is probably one of the more important slides that we put up here. So some people naturally make their decisions based on emotion. And I found that out for myself a lot of times when I was making decisions. There was a lot of emotion, whether that be anger, whether it be frustration, whether it be nervousness. If you're the type of person who makes a decision based on how it feels or what it does to you, that's a different kind of conversation than someone who makes more intellectual decisions, who will make a list and have 10 or 12 different reasons on each side to do it. And neither one is right or wrong. The most important thing is understanding who you are and how that affects your ability to have these conversations. If you are someone that has a lot of emotional component to your decision making, it's good to check yourself and have a little intellectual conversation, maybe make a short list so that you can be more prepared. If you're a person who has lists and only sees things as black and white, you might want to just take a little of the edge off and have a little bit of emotion. That will help you have the conversation with the person. And if you know the other person's style, it's also helpful. If you know that person is much more likely to react in an emotional way, you can be prepared for it and kind of diffuse that versus someone who's going to emote and not show any emotion. That may bother you depending on the kind of person you are. There is no right or wrong in this. It is really about knowing yourself. If you know who you are and how you make decisions and how you have conversations, you're much more likely to be effective in this. And for me, once I understood that I was more prone to making emotional decisions, I would actually be able to kind of curtail the way I was having conversations with people. And I think in some ways I put up a wall, and because I put this wall up, it was sometimes a little fuzzy in what I was saying. I became much more direct and I became much clearer with my conversations when I took that wall down and really started balancing out the decision and how I delivered it. Obviously, you want to have data when you prepare. If this is a conversation that you're having that's difficult and the other person may want information, you should really have done research and have your data together as well. If you're new to it, or if this is going to be a particularly difficult conversation, if you will, rehearse, have that mental conversation. As we know, doing procedures, if you kind of mentally go through them, you're much more facile with it. Same concept for these conversations. If you can kind of mentally go through this conversation, anticipating some pitfalls, anticipating how you may react, you're going to be much better at it. And as you do more of these, this is probably less important. But when you're first taking on the role of doing difficult conversations, I think rehearsing makes a lot of sense. And that doesn't mean you have to have a conversation with somebody else to do it, but just mentally going through, these are the points I really want to make. This is how I think I should react to them, will make it a lot easier for you. I do think you should anticipate, but not script. You can come across very robotic. And then if someone comes outside the script, you're not going to be prepared for it. So you can anticipate how they're going to react. You can anticipate how you're going to react, but don't try to script these conversations. I have found that if I try to do that, either I'm just so focused on delivering the script and I'm not picking up on the cues that the other person's offering, or the other person goes completely off script and then you're not completely prepared for it. So definitely anticipate, but don't script. And I think you have to be in the right emotional state to do this. depending on the difficult nature of the conversation and the person, you have to book the right amount of time. You can't rush these conversations if they're going to be a give and take. And if you're really negotiating and you're trying to get to a win-win situation, you have to give yourself enough runway for that person to respond, as well as for you to be prepared to be a little facile with that as well. So make sure it's in a good time of the day for you. Make sure it's in a good location for you. Make sure that you're ready to have this conversation. And rehearsing will help with that as well. And kind of feeding into that, control what you can control. So if it's a location, quiet, private location, if that's the appropriate setting, with somebody, if that's a more appropriate setting, if you feel like you need to have someone else there with you. So if you can control that, that's certainly helpful. I put invite on there because you want to give the person information who's having this conversation, but you don't want them to come into the conversation already angry or defensive. So you certainly want to give them the right amount of information, but couch it in a way that won't lead them to start the conversation already on edge, because you want them to come in, hopefully to get to a win-win situation with you. So give them the data they need and try to keep it as neutral as you can without inviting too much fear as well. Depending on the power structure, if you're the chair sending it to somebody, that invite is much different than a peer-to-peer invite as well. Like we talked about, getting participants in there. If you feel like there are other people that need to support you, or if it's a situation where you feel could be he said, she said, and you want someone else to be there, you really have to think about that situation and be prepared. Think about timing. Think about, what's the best part of the day? When do you function best? If you're a morning person, that may be the time to have these because you get it out of the way. If you're someone who tends to work better in the evening time, maybe that works, again, depending on the situation. But timing can be really important to you if you function better in certain kind of situations. I'm going to put a plug in here again. I have no ties to this. This book, short, succinct, very easy reading. I have found that was incredibly helpful to me when I was trying to get over that difficulty having these conversations. I find that it's easy to read, but really gets you to the point of, this is what you need to do to have meaningful, succinct, to the point conversations to actually achieve your goals, which is what these conversations are really about, right? We're trying to achieve a goal, whether that's to communicate information about improving performance, if that's improving the conversation in terms of their ability to get a promotion, or if you're giving negative feedback because they really have had some bad interactions. You want to be able to deliver that information so that the person can use it and it's measurable, and you can honestly say when you walk away, you've given them the tools they need to succeed. That's our goal as leaders and throughout academic medicine, is to try to give people the tools to succeed. And I find this book really, really helpful for that. In it, she lists 7 principles, and I'm obviously not going to read it to you, but I do think there's a couple things to point out. The first one is interrogating reality. Know the situation. Again, this kind of goes back to knowing yourself and knowing how you make decisions and have conversations, but it's also about what's the reality of the situation. If it's a conversation you're having that you need to convey to the person, you're not going to survive in this environment if you don't have major changes. You need to say that, and it's uncomfortable to say that, and it's uncomfortable to hear that, but those are the kind of things that just need to be said in order for that person to be successful and to achieve. I think having real conversations is what this is all about. There's no reason to put a wall up or fog or use kind of fancy flowery languages. Get to the point, get it out there so that people can hear what you're saying, understand what you're saying, and you can deliver the most powerful message that you can deliver. You have to be present. You can't be distracted. You can't be on your phone. You can't be thinking about 7 other things. And that goes back to the timing that we talked about. Make sure you have the time to do it and you're in the right position to do it, and just be present. As with so many things in our life, if we're present in that moment, it takes less time. It's much more powerful. And the person's going to walk away feeling, even if they don't like your message, they're going to feel that the message you delivered to them, and they feel more connected with it. They may not like it, but at least you feel connected to it. Talking, toughest challenge of the day for lots of us, these conversations are the absolute worst part of these days. Just do it, get it over with, take it off your calendar. You're going to feel a huge weight of relief come over you. That weight comes off your shoulders because you've taken that problem off of your problem list. We all have huge lists of to-do things. Take these difficult conversations off your list, get them scheduled, get it done, move on, and then you can either have a follow-up conversation, or maybe you'll never have to deal with it again, depending on what the situation is. But get them booked, get them scheduled, get it done. It talks about obeying your instincts. I think this is really true. Listen to your inner voice, as we do in medicine. That inner voice that kind of guides you after you've done this enough years. Listen to your inner voice. Don't try to mess with the radar, if you will. Listen to what your inner voice is telling you and then act on it. For those in leadership positions, your words are very powerful. So take responsibility for that. You are going to create angst and turmoil if you don't use your words carefully. And these conversations should be planned out, and you should have the appropriate data to support it. And it shouldn't be an attack, and it shouldn't be all emotional, and it shouldn't be all data driven. It has to be a combination of the two. But as a leader, your words are incredibly powerful and can lead to an emotional wake behind you. So be aware of that. Be aware that you may, with your words, upset somebody. That's okay as long as you acknowledge it and you're doing it for the betterment of that person, the organization, or whatever it is you're trying to accomplish with this conversation. And silence is often overlooked. You talk to fill the gap, but a lot of times have your say, give it some silence, let those words settle, let those words hit, let the person formulate what they're trying to think about, what you've just said. Silence is incredibly powerful. I think we've learned that over the years. So say what you have to say, but silence also doesn't mean you have to end the conversation. You're uncomfortable, you want it to end, give it a few minutes and let it have a natural ending to it, if that is possible. So I have a handful of scenarios here just to go through, and I'll kind of answer the questions as we go with this. But these are just scenarios I thought of, or some of which I have gone through. And I just want to highlight some of these techniques we've talked about as we try to really get to the crux of what it means to have this difficult conversation and make it easier for you to prepare for them and to actually have them. So in the first scenario, you're a chief resident and the program director has said to you, you have to talk to resident X about some complaints from peers and attendings that they've had. So that's your mission as the chief resident. So we'll think about, what does that mean? So you're going to sit down as the chief resident, you're going to have to invite this person, and you're going to have to really think about how you want to have this conversation. And we'll talk about some of those issues. On the flip side, you're resident X, and you get this notification, whether it's email, text, however you're getting it, from the chief saying you need to talk about some performance issues. So for me, if I get that notification from the chief resident, I start to sweat. I start to think about what could they be talking about, and I probably naturally get defensive, which doesn't lend well to going in and having a productive conversation. So there's a ton of factors that are in play in this. Some of it's the personal relationship. How well does the chief and resident, do they interact? Do they interact outside socially? There may be some factors with that. What authority does the chief have? Is this a conversation as a peer-to-peer kind of guidance? Is there some punitive stuff behind it? What's the nature of the complaints? And I think as the chief resident, the first thing you want to do is get as much data as you can from the program director. What is this? What are the nature of the complaints? What message do you want me to deliver? And I think if you always start these conversations with that in mind, what message am I trying to deliver? Where am I trying to take this conversation? Where am I trying to lead this person? And I don't mean that in a manipulative type of way, but we're having this conversation hopefully to improve this person or improve the organization. So where am I trying to take them? Where am I trying to lead this conversation so that it has a positive outcome for the participants involved and all the other stakeholders involved? So you want to have the data to understand what are the complaints and where do you want me to lead this resident? Do they just need to know about the complaints? Hopefully you're going to help them understand them and give them guidance on how to fix the problem. But you have to start with those information. And then I think you have to ask the resident what's going on, right? Obviously, we've learned this over the years. If it's out of personality, out of character, something's going on. So, we have to figure out what's going on behind the resident's actions. So that has to be part of this conversation is what's their perspective? What are they going through? Do they need help with something? Is there something we don't know about that can help? So it can't be a one-way conversation. It definitely has to be a give and a take. Again, we get into that win-win versus zero sum. This can't be coming down as punitive. It has to be coming down as this is what we're seeing. What's your perspective in that? We talked about desired outcomes. To me, that is probably the key to all of these conversations is what do I desire at the end of that conversation? And for me personally, when I started looking at it that way, it became much easier to have these conversations. What do I hope to have happen when I finish this conversation? And you may say it's not realistic that I know I want this, but they're never going to do that. Well, that may be true. You have to go through the actions and you have to give them the opportunity to fail, if that makes sense. You have to give them the opportunity to hear what you have to say and act on it. That is on them. It's on you to present it in a way that they can get meaningful information and understand where you are and what you want from them. Again, is this the first time you're meeting, or is this a serial conversation that changes how this conversation goes as well? Do you need to document the conversation? Depending what the program director wants. If this is a more structured disciplinary type thing, then there certainly may need to be some documentation. How you invite is really important. A quick, hey, we just need to chat is a whole lot different than we need to meet to discuss. So couching it how you want, and that should really come out of, again, your desired outcome. Where do I want to drive this? What message do I want to send from the very beginning? And then if you're resident X, how do you prepare? Do you know that there's something going on and you need to think about how you're going to talk to your chief about it? You need to be honest, and you need to have an open conversation. And those are probably things you need to look at. And, obviously are the legal issues, policies involved, all that kind of stuff. It depends on the scenario. But having a forthright, honest conversation ultimately is going to be a win-win for you and the program versus trying to get angry, defensive, deflecting. Those don't help these conversations at all. If you find that you're doing that, you're not having a difficult conversation, you're having an argument, and it's not going to be a win-win situation. All right, switching gears just a little bit, we're going to go into a different kind of negotiating situation. So you're finishing residency, you've been offered a job in a desirable location, but pay and benefits aren't what you desire. So what are our options? Our options, obviously, to not take the job. Our options are to grudgingly take the job, having kind of bitterness because, well, they're not giving me what I want. Or again, we're looking at win-win scenarios. Can we sit down with the prospective employer and say, this is what I was hoping for. Are there things that you can either do to help match that, or are there other areas where we can find a win-win? And a lot of this comes down to, is it the most desirable job for you overall? And there are some things that you just want to negotiate, or is it just really the right location and everything else is bad about it? That's a very different conversation. If it's the right location and everything else is bad, then you may not be able to go negotiate enough to get you to a position where it is good or acceptable. And that you might just have to accept as it's not the job for you. But if it's close, but you still need some wiggle room in there, then I would say having an honest conversation / negotiation with the employer could ultimately lead to a win-win for both of you. Maybe they really want you and they're willing to make a few changes for that. Or maybe they realize, you know what, we're not competitive with pay or benefits, and it leads to change. You don't know if you don't ask. And I think that is where this scenario really is. You shouldn't demand, because I don't know that you're going to get anywhere in a demand situation, but having an honest conversation of, this is what I really was hoping for, this is what I need, this is where I want to be, and letting them respond to that. And how they respond to it, you cannot control. Do your part and you give them the data that you want. You can't control what they're going to do. But if you don't ask, you don't know. So I've been talking a lot about zero sum and win-win. And here are the two definitions. Zero sum is a negotiation strategy where one party's gains are directly offset by another party's loss. So I'm going to take your candy and you're going to have none, versus I'm going to give you candy and I'll have none again. So that's a zero sum. In a win-win situation, it's a negotiation strategy where both parties gain roughly equal advantage. It doesn't necessarily mean 100% equal. It doesn't mean 100% quote fair, but it means both parties get closer to a middle situation. And they're agreeing to act in their own interest and interest of the group. So you're looking at your interest as well as the organization, your employer, or the employee, or whoever it is you're having a conversation with. You're trying to convey to them the information they need to succeed. And if we look at these conversations as trying to convey information so that you can succeed and the person hearing it can succeed, you're much more likely to have a productive conversation, and it becomes less difficult. It becomes less of an argument. It becomes less of a battle than it does a true negotiation or conversation. And so the basis of any win-win is compromise and cooperation. And you really have to look at it as not as a competition. And I think for many of us, myself included, we're very competitive people. We want to win. We want to come out on top. And if we approach many of these conversations that way, it's really hard to ultimately win. You may win because you bully or influence, but ultimately it's probably not what's good for the organization. It's not good for the other person in the conversation, and it probably isn't good for you because it does change people's perception of you. If you go in a cooperative compromise, knowing your boundaries. And I think when I talk about win-win, a lot of times people say, oh, that means you're just going to give up things, you're going to get run over. That's actually not true. What I'm saying is, You know your boundaries. This is my minimum. This is my maximum. If everything in between those boundaries is fair game and compromise, that is a much different conversation than I will only accept X or I will only accept Y. If we go into that, we really do become at heads and we don't in any way make progress for you, the organization, other people involved in the conversation. You really want to look at it as long as it stays within my boundaries, I'm willing to negotiate, compromise, ultimately try to get to the middle so we can have a win-win situation for both. And I think if you start reframing these conversations that way, they become much easier. They become much less difficult. And it sets you up for a different type of leader. It really makes you someone who people respect and will come to, knowing that you do certainly have boundaries and that when it crosses a boundary, it becomes a different situation. But you're someone who has given, you will be looked at much differently as someone who comes out with dictatorial powers or fiat or however you want to look at it. If you're solid boundaries, but willing to work within those, people really do tend to respect you much more. All right, scenario number 3, you're a medical director. Your first meeting of the day, which probably is because it's your most difficult conversation of the day, is with Joe, who's a PA in your group, and you have to fire Joe. So depending on your situation, that this may or may not apply to you, but having to fire someone, let someone go, is an incredibly emotional and difficult thing, at least from my perspective. I've done it numerous times. And it's hard because it's impacting somebody's life. They don't want to hear it. But it has to be done. And there are, I think, ways to do it. And we'll just kind of quickly, I'll give you some tips and tricks over things I've done over the years, probably wrong, so that everybody can learn from it. The old saying, hire slow, fire fast, is absolutely true. Make sure in your hiring process, you really are getting input from everybody involved. And if your gut is saying don't go with it, listen to your gut. We talked about that principle a while back. Listen to your radar. If there's something that's off, even though you're desperate to have somebody fill that spot, it is better in the long run to work short and wait until you have the right person to bring onto the team than it is to bring the wrong person onto the team, because it's going to cause tremendous problems for you, tremendous problems for the team. And ultimately, you're going to eventually have to let the person go and start over again. It is difficult to work short staffed. It's difficult to work without a key team member, but it is much worse to work in a team where you have the wrong person involved. And once you've identified someone that needs to go, you just need to have that conversation. Don't drag this out. It's better for you. It's better for the team. It's better for everybody involved. I would say it shouldn't be a surprise to the person you're firing. You should have had multiple conversations up to this point, unless there was something major, egregious that absolutely happened and you have to get rid of them today. If someone's performance has been poor, you should be having honest, forthright conversations with them up to this point. This is what I expect. This is what you're not doing. This is where you need to change. And if that's not happening, then you get to the termination point. That person walking into the room should know this is kind of a conversation we've been having, and I know what's coming. Take the emotion out of it. Just say it with a fact. We've decided to let you go based on previous conversations. Your last day is X, and other parts about HR things can be handled later on once you've had some time to think about it. Short, to the point, no finger pointing, no blame, no emotion. Lay it out there. No, they may come back with emotion, and the idea is to keep these conversations as short as possible. Let the emotion kind of defer over time, and then get back to them about the logistics, HR stuff that are to follow. Keeping it straightforward and simple. Anticipate those emotions and how do you react to them? Again, knowing the type of person you are. Do you get angry if someone gets angry at you? Anticipate that, know that what they may do and how you can diffuse those situations. Again, keeping these conversations compact, because some people will try to argue out of it and try to convince you another chance. We've all been in those situations. Short, compact, timeline, straightforward, concise are the ways to go with those. And hopefully if you've hired very slow, you're not going to have to fire, but you get into those situations where you do. Let's see here. So you have a meeting with the chair to discuss why you weren't promoted in the last round of promotions. This is something that happens pretty regularly. And there's 2 views to look at it. There's you, and there's also the chair. So from your standpoint, you want to come in to this conversation and really look at it as a data gathering. You can go in aggressive and angry, which is totally normal to be angry. You've gotten passed over. Perhaps people have gotten promoted you don't feel deserve it. Those are probably not part of the conversation. To me, you go into this conversation looking to find out from the chair's perspective, where have I not succeeded so that I can get promoted? And it's very natural to go in and say, but Joe did this and he got promoted, or however you want to look at it. I don't think that's a fruitful conversation. I think what you want to say is, I'm disappointed or I'm upset that I didn't get promoted. Can you help me understand why and what I can do going forward? That is a much different conversation than I should have been promoted. Other people were promoted that didn't deserve it. That sets up an antagonistic situation. And I understand there's a lot of emotion, and I understand you may feel like that. That's why having these conversations after you've had some time to think about it and kind of plan it out probably are the most effective. So you should look at it 100% as a data gathering. How does the chair feel? What do they see as your future, and where do they see you going with this? And then as the chair's perspective, just make sure I got everything here. Yeah, are the comments appropriate? Are they well timed, and have you rehearsed them? I think that is the stuff we've talked about, and trying to find a win-win point out of this. So in this case, win-win is you getting promoted, the department getting what they want, which I think is a very reasonable situation. You have to be an active listener in this conversation. This is not one where you're coming in with tons of facts and tons of data and tons of you should, you should, you should. I think being an active listener and gathering that data is critical. The chair, on the other hand, still needs a win-win conversation. This is a faculty member who hopefully you value, and you need to understand, do you want to retain this person as employee? If you don't promote them, there's a chance they will leave and go elsewhere. And what does that mean for the department? What does that mean for you? What does that mean for this faculty member or other faculty members involved? Is this someone who you can coach or mentor? And it doesn't mean you as the chair specifically have to be the coach or mentor, but is there someone in the department who you can hook them up with to give them the skill set that they may be lacking? And it's a good opportunity to find out the faculty member's perspective of what they think they're doing and what you actually think or see them doing, because those two things may not be the same. So if you hear them saying, I am doing this and this, A, you may not be aware of that that's what they're doing, or B, you might tell them that that's not as important as some other things you want to do. You're not meeting our mission or our goal. So it's a good opportunity to revisit, what is your mission and your goal, and am I conveying it appropriately to this faculty member and to other faculty members in the department? I think you have to be direct. I think you have to give facts. And you have to be honest. And these conversations can be uncomfortable. If this person's never going to get promoted for whatever reason, I think you have to lay out to them, I don't foresee you getting promoted because of these things. If you change them, maybe it will happen. Or being honest and saying, even if you change it, for some reason you won't get promoted. Again, depending on the situation. But an honest conversation is much more likely for you to, when that conversation ends, they're going to understand where they stand. You're going to feel that you've given them the data they need, and you won't have to have this conversation again, hopefully. They're not going to come to you every year and say, well, why didn't I get promoted? If you've told them ahead of time, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and until they do it, they're not going to be promoted. That's a very clear conversation. So I would suggest honesty, directness in this case, while maybe uncomfortable to deliver, is much better in the long run for you and for the person involved. I think we have one more scenario, and then we'll kind of wrap up. So you have a very senior member in your group who you need a letter of recommendation for, and they're a very eminent figure in the emergency medicine community. So there's definitely a power difference, right? You're a junior faculty, they're very senior. So how do you approach this? Are there hurdles? Yes, for me there would be. Obviously, there's a power structure, and how well do you know this person? Is this, you don't want to look as a burden, you don't want to look for something out of ordinary, you don't want to ask for additional things. So how do you prepare? I think honestly, trying to figure out, is this person someone who has done this regularly? In our department, we have someone who's very much like this and who is a great champion of faculty development. So you have to know that. It's much easier to have that conversation because you know that person's a faculty development mentor and is very interested in it, versus maybe this person hasn't traditionally been, but then how do you ask them for this in a different way? So knowing your person, knowing what you're asking for, and being very specific what you're asking for. I need this letter for X, and I'm tremendously indebted to you for something like that. Take the emotion out of it. Yes, they're senior. Yes, they're eminent, but you have something in this conversation you want, and this is, again, a negotiation. I have this need. Can you fulfill it, and can you fulfill it on this timeline? Which is sometimes an issue, is I need it in this certain amount of time. All right, so I'm going to kind of give a recap here of the things that we've talked about. The most important is try to have a win-win conversation instead of zero sum. If you can go into it saying, as long as it's within my boundaries, I'm willing to compromise and negotiate so that I can get what I want out of it and the other person can get what they need out of it. These conversations are much, much easier and much more able to have a positive outcome for everybody involved. And I'm not saying every conversation will. There are times when you just have to be direct and say, you cannot do this. and it is not negotiable. There are conversations like that. But the less of those you have, the easier it is. And if you're in a negotiation situation, you absolutely should come into it as a win-win situation conversation. So knowing that it's a negotiation, and most of these conversations really are negotiations, they're not dictatorial conversations. Going into that knowing I want everybody to come out winning, and I know what it is that I want and what I would view as winning or acceptable. There are things that I would like and may not get, but what is my absolute boundaries that I have to have out of this conversation? Prepare, as we talked about, know your data, know the person you're having this conversation with, know yourself. Know, am I an intellectual decision maker? Am I an emotional decision maker? Am I an intellectual conversation having person, or does emotion really fuel how I do it? And neither is right or wrong, but you have to know who you are and then take the edges of that off so that it can be received by the other person, because they may not be. And it could be that if you have two emotional people in the room, it can get really tense. If you have two intellectual people, nobody may actually hear what you're saying. So take those edges off so that your emotion can meet their intellect and vice versa. And I think if you know who you are, it helps you prepare tremendously and helps make these conversations much easier. Try to take that emotion out if you can. You know what you want going in. This is how I view what I want going in. These are my boundaries. Let that other person have their emotion, have their say. As long as you leave the conversation having put out what you feel is what you wanted and what you wanted to get out of it, you have done your part. You cannot control the other person. You can't control their reaction. You can control how you present it, how you react to what they say, and how you deal with the information that you gather. A lot of this is active listening. A lot of this is having an interactive conversation. And again, this is not an innate skill. You can have these conversations. If you're someone who struggles with these, practice, read the books. And certainly, again, I have no tie to it. The book I suggested is a great starting point. There's several others out there about having difficult conversations. Usually they're short, they're easy. Spend some time thinking about it. As these conversations become more prevalent in your practice or your leadership, think more about it. Spend some time listening to people who know what they're talking about and have done this. There are tons of resources out there. But really, you can do this. No matter you think you're not someone who enjoys conflict, you're not someone who likes having these conversations. Most of us don't. And most of us don't want to do it, but we've realized we have to do it and can do it. And you can do that too by practice, by reaching out to people. And I'm happy to talk. If people want to reach out to me, I'll have my contact information. I'm happy to talk one-on-one about things that I've struggled with or things that I suggest to do. And again, I'm not an expert. There are tons of people out there who can give you really, really good advice. So we're not born good negotiators. With practice, you can master this skill. Using a zero-sum outcome will lead to failure in the majority of these cases. Practice for win-win. We talked about preparation. Have the conversation. If there's a conversation that you know you've been putting off, book it today, because the sooner you do, that weight gets lifted off of you, and it's one less thing on your to-do list. And I guarantee that to-do list, you'll keep shuffling it and moving that conversation further and further down. If it's an important conversation, it should be had. If it's important to you, if it's important to the organization, if it's important to the person you're having the conversation with, if it's someone that you're mentoring and they need to have a difficult conversation, you owe it to them to do that. Book the conversation, have the conversation. You'll actually feel better in the long run if you do it and have it over with. So I encourage you, get it on your schedule, make it happen. Don't impulse do it. Make sure you have prepared, etc. But get it on your schedule today. Do a post-conversation evaluation. How did you do? Whether that's just sitting down and thinking about, was I effective in delivering the conversation that I wanted to deliver? Was I effective in getting my point across? Did it go as I thought it would go? And from that, again, you can learn and you can adjust going forward. The same way as when we do procedures. We mentally go through them, we do them. Sometimes things don't go perfectly, and you've learned over the years how to adjust that. Same thing for conversations. Don't beat yourself up over it. Don't replay it 100 times, but just in general, was I successful in conveying the message I wanted to convey? And then follow up where appropriate. If it's something that in the conversation you've agreed in 2 weeks, we'll touch base again, or you'll check some data, whatever it is, make sure whatever you promised in the conversation as a deliverable, you deliver on in that time frame. And then if it's something you just need to check in with a person and see how they're doing, totally appropriate to do that. But that is probably as important. If in the conversation you have promised something that you're going to deliver, make sure you deliver on it. If you have questions, if you have things that you agreed with, disagreed with, anything like that, certainly reach out to me. Please send an email. You'll see my Twitter stuff here in a second. Whatever it is, I'm happy to answer, happy to at least share my perspective of it. I definitely encourage you to reach out to others. You'll find people in your department that are very good at having these conversations. Sit down, pick their brain, ask them how they became better at it. I would almost guarantee it's through practice and through realizing that having win-win conversations are much easier than trying to have these zero-sum conversations. So that's me. That's how you can reach me. I'm happy to talk about anything at any time. And hopefully this has been helpful. I would encourage you to go out, have these conversations. You can do it. And I really do think you'll be successful at it if you just think about it as a negotiation and you trying to get within your boundaries what you think you can get in a compromising situation. So I appreciate you joining us and look forward to talking to you guys again in the future sometime.